Okay, so my talk today is about the concept essentially of opium slavery, which is the way, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, but the phrase comes from the descriptive language that US Civil War veterans would use to describe addiction. The Civil War, which occurred between 1861 and 1865, is a major pivot point in American history, but it was also the United States' biggest public health disaster up to that point. There were millions and millions of cases of sickness among the troops who waged the war, which was just a devastating conflict in many areas of the country. It caused a lot of sickness and pain. Opium and also other opiate derivatives like morphine were some of the most commonly used medicines during the US Civil War and also before the war as well. So predictably, military medical care for sickness and pain led to widespread opium and morphine addiction among the men who survived the Civil War in the post-war decades. And eventually, 10, 20, 25 years out of the Civil War, the number of addiction cases among US Civil War veterans escalated to the point that addiction became a major problem. Everyone considered it, everyone living at that time, when they thought about opium, they considered it to be a problem, and also a problem particularly associated with veterans. And this problem of addiction is what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm in this talk, I'll be considering two primary questions. The first is, what did Civil War veterans addiction mean to the men who struggled with opium dependency? So I'm sort of looking at it from this perspective, from a bottom-up point of view. The second question that we'll be discussing is the flip side to that coin, and that is, what did it mean to the doctors who got veterans hooked on opium? What was the professional problem of opium for US doctors in the post-Civil War period? It's also worth noting, and I'm sure that this thought is occurring to some members of the audience, that the post-Civil War addiction crisis in the US actually has a lot of parallels with the US's ongoing opioid crisis. And I'd love to talk more about these in the Q&A, and some of them are going to become apparent during this talk. But speaking of today's opioid crisis in the US, most people, historians and most Americans, are generally surprised to learn that the US has experienced an opioid crisis before. And that's because I think for American historians, opium and opium addiction usually come into the picture only later in the very late 19th century, early 20th century. And that usually is framed as in relation to American imperialism in Asia or Chinese exclusion, or later on in the early 20th century, it's related to heroin and the outlawing of heroin. But decades before opium in US history became linked to imperialism or urban vice control, Americans of the Civil War generation made a connection between the problem of opium and the problems that Civil War veterans posed in the post-war decades. So all that is to say that what I'm going to do today is to illuminate a couple of different things. First, how the Civil War caused an opium addiction crisis among veterans, and then I'm going to zoom in on the two main problems that addiction posed in the post-war decades. And so I'll sort of go ahead and state these problems up front before diving into them individually. Oops, go back there. First, opium addiction can be understood as a personal problem for Civil War veterans. So again, like I mentioned, I'm sort of, part of my research is constructing this social and cultural history of opium addiction by looking at the problem of addiction from veterans' points of view. And so when we consider the crisis from the bottom up, it's clear that widespread opium and opiate addiction among veterans was just bad for them. It was seriously bad for veterans. Opium addiction caused fatal overdoses. It caused lost income and poverty. It ruined their reputations. In many cases, it led to incarceration in various forms. So there's this whole hidden history of personal problems relating to opium addiction. On the flip side of that coin, opium was also widely understood among American doctors and also government officials as a professional problem for the medical profession. It challenged doctors' reputation in what was a uniquely competitive medical marketplace in the 19th century US. And again, these two problems, the personal and the professional problems posed by opium, are really two sides of the same coin. Okay, so first let's start with the question, how did the Civil War cause an opium addiction crisis among veterans? And And this story is actually quite simple, if not tragic. Again, like I mentioned, the Civil War was just a massive public health crisis, and it's almost like mind-boggling the scale of this crisis. It was the biggest in American history up to that point, and I think there's still a strong case that if you look at sort of the per capita number of deaths stemming from the US Civil War, it was the most destructive public health crisis in American history. 1 million Americans died from the Civil War in just these 4 short years, and that is about 3% of the American population at that time. And so to put this in perspective of today, it would take about 10 million American COVID deaths to equal the Civil War's per capita death toll. So this was a tremendously destructive conflict, and 2/3 of those deaths were from sicknesses, many of which the major treatment was opium and morphine. The war caused a huge influx of pain and illnesses. American doctors had really never seen anything like this before, anything on this scale. And so to deal with this unprecedented, sort of spiraling out of control medical crisis, doctors basically had to double down on the most basic of medical therapies, which at that time were prescription opiates like opium and also to a much lesser degree morphine. By 1861, the year that the Civil War broke out, opium and its derivatives were by far the most commonly prescribed medications in the US. They were major parts of the doctor's black bag. To put some numbers on it, opium was in somewhere between 50 and 80% of all prescriptions in the 19th century US at that point. So this was just a ubiquitous medicine. And I'll show you a couple of opium prescriptions. These are actual Civil War prescriptions that contained opiates. And as we can see, if you were to zoom in on these, basically what these are lists of different medicines, including opium, that were compounded to make various medical preparations. So opium, the point here is that opium was in all different kinds of medicines. It wasn't just given as a standalone drug too. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So suffice it to say that Civil War doctors used opium and morphine for practically everything. My favorite, I hope no one is eating lunch here, so this is a warning for those that are, but my favorite is probably the most common disease to Civil War veterans in the post-war period, something that they called chronic diarrhea. And this was essentially cases of diarrhea that began with the Civil War. Civil War camps were very dirty places, so oftentimes veterans would pick up parasites and sort of lifelong conditions that would cause diarrhea. And so they would literally have chronic diarrhea for decades and decades. The treatment, again, for this condition was opium. Opium causes constipation, so it reverses the effects of the diarrhea. So you can imagine how that might lead to long-term opium use, which then turned into opium addiction, right? Another major use of opiates, particularly morphine, was as painkillers. And I think this is sort of what when we imagine the American Civil War and particularly Civil War medicine, what comes to mind are these horrific gunshot wounds and cases of amputation. And so that's what we see here in the photo, a survived case of amputation. This individual was lucky. Surgeons gave, excuse me, during the US Civil War, surgeons started giving hypodermic morphine shots and also morphine pills as painkillers. And this wasn't something that was common before the war. So this was actually a medical innovation in the US that stemmed out of the conflict, but it became extremely popular after the Civil War to use hypodermic morphine as a painkiller. It would take months and sometimes years to heal from the gunshot wounds and other sort of painful injuries that came out of the Civil War. And that was long enough to become habituated to morphine and opium if you use them as pain control or painkillers. Okay, so these medicines were really, really important for Civil War armies. There's no way that the Civil War armies could have really functioned without opium. And I think that that's something that oftentimes Civil War historians forget, is that the basic medical stuff of the Civil War is really the grease that sort of kept the gears of the war going. The Confederate Army Medical Handbook put it like this: opium, the handbook wrote, is the one indispensable drug on the battlefield, important to the surgeon as gunpowder to the ordnance. So again, this drug was central to just the nitty-gritty daily life and also sort of the grand operations of the Civil War. And I think any soldier would have understood that metaphor. So fast forward a couple of decades, about 20 years or so out of the war, and unsurprisingly, because of the medical use of opium during the war, tens of thousands of Civil War veterans have become addicted to opiates through military medical care and also through self-medication, which was very, very common as well. So now that we've discussed sort of how this crisis began, I'll pivot to these two main problems that opiate abuse presented in the post-war US. The first of which is that opium addiction was a major personal problem for Civil War veterans. Most immediately, it was unhealthy, right? Opium addiction had really serious life-threatening implications for the body. And so that's kind of where I'll start. Obviously, it led to frequent overdose deaths among veterans. And I'll tell you about one of these deaths briefly. I have a new article coming out this month about this individual, and I'd be happy to share that with anyone who's interested in the specifics of the story. But oftentimes, Civil War veterans would die of opiate overdoses. This was a very common way for veterans to die. And if you read sort of some of the newspaper obituaries stemming from the post-Civil War decades, you'll find cases of Civil War veterans who have overdosed to death on opium or morphine, and you'll also find plenty of opium suicides as well. One of these individuals was a 20-something-year-old Confederate soldier, this guy Frank Kluel, who we see here in the image. Frank died on a trip to St. Louis. He was visiting some friends in 1867. He was from North Carolina. He went out to St. Louis. He took morphine every day because he was addicted to it to treat his chronic diarrhea, as I mentioned. And one day he took too much. This is something that commonly happened to Civil War veterans who became addicted, and he died alone in a hotel room. Again, this was a major problem for Civil War veterans after the war. So you can just imagine sort of the psychological toll that this would have taken on their families too. More than just a cause of death, addiction was also deeply stigmatized in American society. To be addicted to opium was oftentimes described by Civil War veterans as a kind of slavery. And this is where the title of my book manuscript comes from. To be enslaved to opium was it was a very loaded metaphor, and it meant a lot of different things, and it signals some of the stigmas attached to addiction. First and foremost, opium slavery harmed one's manhood and reputation. And this was one of the primary markers of identity in the Civil War era United States. You're standing as a man, right? And so I'll give you an example of sort of how opium addiction detracted from one's manhood. Joseph Darrow, who was a Michigan soldier who survived the Civil War, also became addicted to morphine, like the guy in the image here, Frank Kluel. And Darrow explained his addiction like this. He wrote at one point that he was, quote, a slave to the habit of using morphine, with not a ray of hope of ever being emancipated. And so you can see in a war that's just been fought over the issue of slavery, how veterans took the metaphor of slavery upon themselves to describe their addiction. Again, opium slavery was a really loaded description, and I think it really perfectly captures the personal toll of addiction for veterans. For example, dependency. Addicted veterans needed to take opium daily to function, or else they would go into withdrawal and other unpleasant, all of the unpleasantness that came from that. So, suffice it to say that they were dependent on the drugs. They needed to take the drugs. They could not do without. But during the Civil War era, according to prevailing gender norms, white men who made up the bulk of Civil War armies were supposed to be self-controlled and independent. The opposite of dependent, right? They were supposed to be reliant on only themselves. So opiate dependency signaled that they had lost that element of their identity. You couldn't quit opium whenever, you couldn't quit at will. It was almost as if Civil War veterans were bound to the dictates of opium as their master. And that's really what the metaphor of opium slavery gets at. They consider themselves to be much like American slaves. Consider also pain relief. This is something that I think kind of flies under the radar sometimes when we think about opium. But in the US, ideas about pain relief were very different than ideas that we have today in American culture. According to the way of understanding the body and understanding medicine in the Civil War era, not everyone was supposed to actually need painkillers. It was thought by American doctors that only white women had sensitive enough bodies to actually feel pain to a degree that would require the long-term use of painkillers. Certainly when a surgeon was giving an amputation or performing an amputation, that necessitated a dose of painkiller. But it was sort of an anathema to American doctors to think that a white man could suffer enough pain to need long-term opiate therapy. But that's what was occurring with Civil War veterans. Men were supposed to be like stoic and grit their teeth and sort of deal with whatever pain that they might have unaided. So when ailing Civil War veterans took morphine day after day after day, sometimes for decades, it made them look effeminate, the opposite of manly. And it's also worth mentioning that opiate abuse caused impotence. So it literally emasculated veterans in many different ways. My favorite way is actually what it did to veterans' physical bodies, what you could actually see after decades of addiction. Years of opiate abuse oftentimes caused really serious, really dramatic weight loss. People who take opium for long periods of time suffer from weight loss and fatigue and gastrointestinal issues like constipation. And so some of the cases in my book are men that lost 50, 60 pounds over the course of their opium addictions. That's a lot of weight, so much weight that you could visually see that there was something different about these individuals than before they became addicted. One addicted veteran put it like this. He described himself like this. He wrote, "My physical manhood was a wreck, a shell, when he was abusing morphine every day." So, and that's really what these two images are signaling here, that transition, the physical transition that was posed by the problem of opium for veterans. Men were supposed to be, during this time period, these sort of barrel-chested, strong, Teddy Roosevelt looking guys. Like you can imagine the image of the American president, Teddy Roosevelt. He's this big, like kind of weightlifter looking guy. And that was the idealized body image for white men during this time period. That's what Civil War veterans were supposed to look like. But that's not how individuals who were addicted to opium could look. They physically lost a ton of weight, and they looked more like the individual on the right-hand side of the slide here. So you could physically see that there was a problem for these veterans too. Not to mention the fact that opiate addiction could be really expensive. In my book, I track how opium abuse affected soldiers and soldiers' family or veterans and their families' budgets. In some cases, I found that the purchasing of opium and morphine added up to 50 or 60% of a family's budget. And Civil War veterans were oftentimes quite poor. So this could be a really debilitating financial problem as well. Eventually, the problem of opiate addiction escalated to epidemic levels in the 1870s and 1880s. So if you read eyewitness accounts of Civil War veterans and opiate addiction after the war, you find that newspapers began describing this as an actual epidemic, right? And so that leads me to the second problem posed by opium, and that is a professional problem for physicians. Addicted veterans and their families vocally blamed doctors for causing the addiction crisis. I'll give you one example, and that's the example of Charles L. Williams, who was a Michigan veteran. In 1895, Charles Williams applied for admission into a soldier's home, which was essentially a medical facility where disabled soldiers could go and live when they were unable to care for themselves. So Williams told the people that were in charge of the home that he had become, quote, totally unable to earn a living because he had contracted the opium habit during the war. And so when they asked him how he came about becoming addicted, he was careful to point out, quote, that the drug was given by Army surgeons. So he was putting the blame on the doctors who initially prescribed opium instead of himself, right? And so this blame for causing addiction could be really problematic for the medical profession, considering the state of the medical sector in the 19th century US. Unlike medicine today in the US, which is much more regulated, this was an era, the post-Civil War decades were an era of almost no medical regulations whatsoever. Anyone in the United States could, without a medical degree, without really any training at all, or without a license, just simply say, I am a doctor. And poof, they became a practicing doctor and they could sell their services as they wanted to. So this kind of... Absolutely. So all of that is to say that doctors did not have a monopoly on medicine, as they would later achieve in the progressive era and in the 20th century US. There were dozens of other kind of medical sects. And so anything that drove medical consumers out of the reach of physicians and into the businesses of other kinds of medical healers was bad for the medical profession. My personal favorite alternative to physicians' medical practices were patent medicines. And so here on the slide, we see a postcard advertising for a kind of patent medicine. And this was a medicine, an over-the-counter, think of it as snake oil medicines. That's kind of what we're talking about here. This was a product that many Civil War veterans purchased to rid themselves or cure themselves of opiate addiction. And it was also tremendously expensive. It didn't work, and I'd be happy to talk more about that and the specifics of it in the Q&A. But all of that is to say that we can really see how the problem of addiction being blamed for causing addiction and the different sort of ripple effects there took away from the medical profession's prestige and power. So again, opium addiction presented a dual problem. It was a personal problem for Civil War veterans, and it was also a professional problem for American doctors in the post-war period. And so I'll stop there. Thanks for listening, and I'll turn it back over to our chair. And I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about any of this and more. Thanks.